Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history.
Welcome, everyone. This is your podcast, New Books in Economic and Business History. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Today, I have the great pleasure to be with Johan Fourie. He's professor of economics and history at Stellenbosch University. And he's the author of a recently published book by Cambridge University Press called Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, Lessons from 100,000 Years of Human History. I'm very happy to be here with Johan. Johan, how are you?
I'm very good, Javier. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you're probably one of the first persons that I thought when I decided to get involved in this podcast. I'm going to tell you why later, but that's one of the reasons why I'm very happy to be here with you and to talk about your book. But before doing that, I would like to hear more about your career. I've known you for a few years, but would you mind sharing with our audience, where do you come from? Where did you grow up? How did you end up being interested in economic history? How did you end up writing this book?
Sure. So I'm South African. I grew up in South Africa in the Western Cape, not too far actually from Stellenbosch University. Came to Stellenbosch, studied here. Wanted to be a journalist, and because I thought journalism is the way to change the world. But very soon realized that that's probably not the way to change the world, and also that journalists don't learn a lot. And I was really hooked by economics. So I did economics until the master's level, and then I had to look for jobs. And I only had one job interview and failed that miserably at the last with the last question. I think the question was, what is the difference between theft and corruption? And I had no idea, and I still really don't know what the answer is. But they suggested that it's something to do with theft. Can involve one person, whereas corruption inevitably involves two. So I didn't get the consulting job, and then the university wanted a kind of a lecturer, and I thought I might as well stay in Stellenbosch. It's a great town, so I applied for that, and I got the gig, and that was 2006, and here I am. I'm still here. So I started actually as a lecturer teaching, and my focus, my area of expertise was actually international trade. And then I found this data set of 17th and 18th century ship traffic to the Cape of Good Hope. And I thought that's kind of an interesting kind of trade paper to write, and collaborated with a colleague and a friend, and sent this paper off to a conference in Portugal, basically because I always wanted to go to Portugal. I thought it would be a great country to visit. And at the conference, there were 4 people in the room, in the venue where we presented, and those were the 4 presenters. So it wasn't great attendance, and we felt a bit embarrassed. But then afterwards, there was a meeting for all the economists at this. It was an economic history conference, and there was a meeting for the economists, and I got there and I met, met randomly really someone who asked to send him the paper, and I did so. And a couple of months later, he invited me to Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and that's where I really discovered economic history. And so he suggested that I do a PhD instead of in international trade. I would do it in economic history, and that's really where I fell in love with the field, and that was 2008. And I completed my PhD there in 2012. I would still teach in Stellenbosch, but I would travel back and forth to complete the PhD. And really, it was a very simple question. The question was, how affluent was the 18th century Cape? And I used various kinds of data sources for that. The wonderful thing about Cape research is that Cape economic history is that we've got such a depth of and a kind of richness of data that we can use, and so that was wonderful. No one had really exploited that before, and since then I've been at Stellenbosch and taught economic history and done some research in both kind of Cape, mostly South African economic history, but also South African economic history.
I'm gonna ask you more about your career in a bit, but I'm curious out that you mentioned that South Africa had this richness in data that had not been used before. Why was that the case? Was that like an intellectual tradition issue, or like I don't know? Tell me about that.
Sure. I mean, it's actually a very easy answer. It's the Cape Colony was governed by a company, and so companies collect a lot of records because they obviously want to maximize their profits. So we certainly for the first 140 years or so, we have since the arrival of Europeans in the mid 17th century, we have incredible data on the free settlers that lived here, and as a consequence also on the enslaved people that were brought here, and that tradition really was continued when the British took over at the start of the 19th century. So for the Cape, certainly the Cape Colony, later the Cape Province, we have really rich data. For the rest of South Africa, not so much. So you actually see quite a lot of variation in both the quantity and quality of data for different parts of South Africa. But the area which I focused on had quite a lot of data, and that was partly because of the fact that it was a company that governed us.
Right, but why? I mean, that's actually very interesting. I had not thought about that. But now, like recently, why have scholars not paid much attention to that data? If it was, I mean, you described it as it was this treasure that was there, and it was not. It had been interesting for a while.
Well, I guess it's partly true for most of African economic history is that it's often not the first place people go to find interesting data, right? So that's the one thing, and secondly, it's actually pretty expensive to transcribe these kinds of records. So I was fortunate in that when I started my PhD, it was about 5 years after a group of historians had actually taken the effort and time to transcribe the probate inventories, which I was using. But since then, we've been applying for funding, mostly European funding, to continue the transcription of these various kinds of sources. The one major source, for example, is a tax census that every year, annual tax census, the company recorded these basically the entire free settler population, and we have now, for the last 7 years, been transcribing that. We've got a team of people in the Cape Archives doing that, and that will allow us ultimately to basically plot the income production of the settler population over 140 odd years. At the household level, right? So we can also build a panel, and that's the idea. Is the name of the project is the Cape of Good Hope Panel Project, and match these individuals across time, match generations. So you would not only be able to do like an intra kind of household mobility things, but also intragenerational type studies. So that's the hope, and then you can match in all of these additional data sets like the probates, like auction records, all of these kind of things. So it's really rich data, and it's not that it wasn't known. It was just, I think, really difficult and expensive to compile all of this. And we are very optimistic that we can do this, but ultimately it always takes much longer than we think it will. And the data problems of cleaning it and these kind of things are immense, but there's a great opportunity there for scholars to work on.
That's fascinating, and let me use that to ask you about how do you feel, like how is it to be an economic historian in South Africa, right? So, I mean, you have a very particular profile, and in the sense that you have managed to build this very successful career with an international school from South Africa, right? And what you're describing seems that being there provides you all these advantages that come from having access to the sources and so on. But I can imagine that it probably comes with some other costs. And I would like to hear about that. It seems that every scholar that I've interviewed here has different perspectives on this. So I talked to Piketty, and he told me about his decision to move back to France, for instance, and how that gave him the freedom to start writing books instead of articles, for instance, right? I talked to Juan Flores recently. He's a professor at Geneva, and but has experience in Latin America, and he tells me how bridging like those universes provides some advantages. What's your experience in that? How do you think about this? How have you thought about that in the past? Has that view of it changed over time? I don't know. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a couple of ways to answer this question. I think the one thing I would say is that I found the international community incredibly supportive and engaged with what we do, and that's wonderful. So I guess partly the reason I chose economic history ultimately was just the kind of interest that people had in not only my work but in the kind of work that we do at Stellenbosch. So we've now built up quite a nice team of people that are interested in African economic history more broadly, and the international networks that we've established makes it a really kind of great environment to produce new and interesting research in. The reception in South Africa has been slightly different, I think. I think it's more a case of indifference, actually. That it's people are very much stuck in their ivory towers. If you're an historian, you're a historian. And in South Africa, we tend to focus quite a lot still on political history for understandable reasons. But increasingly also, I would say, like environmental history and histories that are often quite distant from kind of more quantitative economic history. And in economics, there had not really been a lot of work in economic history. There's an older tradition of economic history. It was specifically informed by battles during the apartheid era between kind of the Marxist school and the more liberal school. And that's, when I joined, for example, the society, that really, that battle had still continued, and ultimately it was an older generation, and it, it required some energy and dynamism from a younger generation to actually, again, engage with an international scholarship, which had, certainly moved on from those old battles. So I think, in short, I think the experience I've had has been one of an openness when I travel abroad and I present, and people are keen to hear more about the work that we do here. The benefit of being here, of course, is that the sources are close by, and part of what excites me about economic history is also that we can attract a new generation of scholars, that the students are here, right? And economic history, I think, is a wonderful way for students to be exposed to many different types of subfields within economics. So you can do kind of, development type work, but you can also do monetary economics, and you can do public economics, and all kinds of different theories that you can that link up nicely with historical data. You can test theories using historical data sets. So I think it's a wonderful platform for students to be exposed to many different types of approaches, and then also to launch for those students that are very keen to Europe or to the US, and have their work read, but also find PhD positions or postdoc positions. So I think that's where I think the nice advantages are of being based in Stellenbosch. But it is, of course, also very useful to have a large international network to collaborate with, to attract funding, and to have a platform for your students to be exposed to new opportunities.
Yeah, there's something in your answer to this question that I mean, it's a feature that I've always admired of your career, which is this interest for educating and this concern for leaving something the future generation, right? Um, and this is a way to get into your book. I had the impression while reading it that you have that in mind, right? So it felt that you were recruiting souls to be economic historians. And the first thing that I noticed I wanted to ask you about is like what did you think about the book and the structure that it had at the end, right? So for those that have not seen the book, it's a book that has quite a few chapters, and they're rather short chapters, right? And every chapter begins with a question, right? So the title of the chapter is a question, right? Why did you design the book like that? What did you have in mind?
Yeah, I didn't think of it this way, but I've been accused of using clickbait titles, and it's exactly what it is. These are clickbait titles. But the idea is really to make it accessible, right? So you're a second year student, so this is a book based on a course that I've been teaching since 2011, and I know, if you're a second year student, there are more important things than reading, chapters of your textbook. So it has to be engaging, it has to be accessible, and I hope even sometimes a bit entertaining. So they are short; they're between 2,000 and 2,500 words. So the idea is that before the next day's class, you would quickly pick it up and read it and get a sense of what the chapter is about, at least. But it's also kind of a nice disciplining exercise, because you are forced as an author then to make sure that you only get the really, the essence of the story. So it's much almost easier to write longer pieces than shorter pieces, because you have to weigh up every kind of detail and say, is this really necessary to tell, a story that is kind of attractive to read. So I wrote the book basically in a couple of months, really, during hard lockdown in South Africa in 2020, the start of COVID, and the idea was not actually to make this a book that's accessible for a more general audience. The plan was really to just provide lecture notes for my students, and then when I got to probably chapter 20, the students enjoyed it so much, and they said, well, this is a great book, and my brother also enjoys it, and my father also enjoys it, and then I had a good friend who was in the publishing industry in South Africa, and she said, well, I'll have a read, and she said, I think there's a book in here, and I sent it to 3 publishers, I think, in South Africa. Only one responded, and she said, let's do it. So I never even thought of publishing it internationally. It's a very strange arrangement now, because it's been published in South Africa. I then rewrote much of it for the Cambridge edition. So it's a strange deal, and both publishers actually, they have to come up with a new, negotiate a new arrangement for this to happen. But I'm very, very happy that it ultimately worked out.
That sounds great. I'm just concerned about the royalties of that. If you have to
you have
split that with 2 publishers.
You have a good sense that, I certainly, I think the one lesson I've learned is not to write with income as a primary concern, because then you're never going to be happy. So it's certainly not. It's not going to feed me, but it's certainly it's nice to know that your ideas are read beyond your classroom. I think it also, the one thing I would say is that no one else could have written this book, to put it kind of very bluntly, not in the way it's written, right? Because many of my own experiences actually inform this book. Almost all the places that I mention, I traveled to them. It's part of the last decade of travels that I had. And so it's a very personal, I mean, you don't need to know that to enjoy the book, but it is actually a very personal kind of book. And so it's nice to know that I produced that, and that it's there, and if a bus were to eat me tomorrow, then at least the book, this experience that I've had, or experiences that I've had, is kind of remains in a way that people found interesting to read. So it is certainly, even if only my mother buys a copy, then it would still be something that I'm proud of.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. I enjoyed it a lot. But that seems to be a good perspective to approach writing a book. I was talking to Chris Bladman here a few weeks ago, and he brought exactly that same point, that you needed to have a personal drive to work on that, because any other like external type of reward that you were concerned of, like if it would be like money uh, or fame as a result of your book, is probably not gonna come, and you're gonna be very miserable if that's what's driving you.
Yeah. I mean, you're gonna just be disappointed. That's it, right? And so I think my experience from publishing the South African issue first. So obviously, I've had now a year of feedback on that, and it is what I do find interesting. It's very interesting to see who enjoys the book. And what they enjoy about the book. So I get quite feedback quite often, and now also invites to events where I have to speak, and these are opportunities that I would never have had without the book, and they put me into settings and into audiences far beyond the classroom, and that's something that I enjoy too. So yes, the money is not certainly something that should weigh on your decision to write a book. Although I think Chris Bladman's book is probably going to earn him at least some. Certainly, Piketty did pretty well. But I'm actually reading Chris's book at the moment, and it is great, right? It's like you can see it's written with. You're with him in Uganda, and it's wonderful. I mean, I learn a lot, so it is great. So if you do have a story to tell, I think you should tell it. That's basically the point I'd make, right? But don't go and search, I think, for a story just to make money. I think that's a terrible idea.
Let me then ask you about the audience that you were targeting, or at least how you were thinking about this, in the sense that you begin the book with this interesting comparison between these two board games. One of them was Monopoly, and you describe how Monopoly frames the economy or society as a zero-sum game, right? One person eventually takes over everything, and the rest are losing, right? And you do that as a way to describe how the world actually works in a different way, and how economic history allows you to perceive that. And then you describe how living conditions have improved for most of the world if you have a long perspective of time, right? But the fact that you begin with that analogy gives the impression that you're talking to people that are not thinking about economic history, but are thinking about current events, and they're probably absorbed by a pessimistic view of the world, which I kind of agree that dominates public opinion. I know that you're very interested in current events. So what were you thinking where you were writing that? And why do you think that if the evidence of the long-term improvement in living conditions is so clear and evident, and actually you can very easily relate it, pretty much, and by you, I mean everyone, if they think about the history of their families, why do you think that it's so prevalent, the pessimistic view on that?
Mm-hmm. I think the person I had in mind initially was my second year students, and perhaps it's useful to just reflect on how actually young these students are. So when I would mention in my class this year, for example, something about the 2010 World Cup, which to me seems like yesterday, I realized that these students were 5, 6 years old. Right? They don't remember anything about the 2010 World Cup. For them, this is a historic event. So the experience that they've had of South Africa is of a country with negative growth. That's their formative years have been of South Africa in decline, whereas my formative years were exactly the opposite. I experienced South Africa when I left the university, or at least when I graduated. I never left, but South Africa had a growth rate of 5%. Right, this was and we were upset with a 5%. We were like asking, why did only 5%? We want 8%, 9%. So, which is looking back, quite silly thing to do, but still, that was the kind of optimism we had of the future of South Africa. So I think my audience is the current generation of South Africans. That was the initial plan, is to tell them, listen, this is not how things need to be. They can be very different. In fact, South Africa, when I kind of entered high school, was a place of quite a lot of pessimism. Right? Just before the democracy, there was talk of civil war, there was mass poverty, poor education system, all the things that we now again are wondering about. That was certainly the case. High inflation, high debt to GDP, and within basically 10, 15 years, we managed to shift the country completely into the opposite direction. Right, the things were improving. We were building an electric car in 2007, right, before Elon Musk did so. So that's the story that I wanted to tell, and then I realized also that perhaps it's not just the generational thing in South Africa. Perhaps it's kind of broadly. And I realized the more you read, that you would know this, that there is quite a lot of pessimism globally, and of course COVID contributed to that. So I understand why people are pessimistic, but you cannot be an economic historian and not be an optimist. Like it's almost impossible, right? So, and then I think that message got lost, right? It's very difficult to tell sometimes an optimistic story, but the way I also phrase it, I think, is to say, well, just look at some of these famous people that we know. Most of them actually became famous, or when we think about the entrepreneurs, the famous ones, because they invested during tough times, right? Henry Frick is the great story in the book, where he buys up all these coke plants during a massive recession, and so I think those are the kinds of hopeful messages that I want to convey during a time like this. And then the final thing I'll say about the kind of optimism, pessimism story is that I also find, perhaps this is a slightly more contentious topic, but I also find that there are certain faculties, certainly at Stellenbosch, but I suspect across South Africa and maybe even internationally, where a pessimistic view of the world is told or taught to students, right? That I would teach guest lectures in our history faculty, also to second year students. And then afterwards, students would come to me and say, why have we never heard this story before? And I'm just, flabbergasted that you would be at a university in the humanities faculty where you would not know anything about what happened the last 200 years, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. So that to me is, this amazing story of progress, of longer lives, better lives. Some might even say more meaningful lives, because we can afford to have investments that protect the environment and all of these kind of things. So, but that story is never told. It's only the kind of opposite, the story of exploitation, expropriation that is often told in those faculties. Now, I'm not saying again that shouldn't be told. Of course, there's room for diverse views, but not to be engaged with the positive, empirically sound view of the last 200 years, I think, is problematic. And so hopefully I also, my hope was that the book would partly fill that gap as well.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation that I hadn't thought about before. The idea, which I I mean, I sort of perceive something similar, that in a certain way, economists have become this sort of optimistic community, which is kind of funny if you think about the origins of the discipline, right? That it had this reputation for being a somber type of
The dismal
of
science.
research, right? That's great. Let's talk a bit about that. And with this, I want to open the box of African history, right? So you describe, and I had the quote here. The book is unashamedly written from South Africa, from a South African and African perspective, right? And I was thinking about what that meant, and probably in the US, people would say a book on African history is maybe a book of the Black communities that have been forgotten or something like that. But whoever knows a bit about Africa knows that there's a lot of diversity in the continent and whatever is the society, you can call that a society, right? And I'm familiar, for instance, with what is done in North Africa, which is something that is probably more connected to the Middle Eastern traditions and Islamic studies. But I'm sure there's much more diversity even in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So in development economics, people talk regularly about Sub-Saharan Africa as if that was one thing. But how do you, so I guess my question for you is, how did you approach that issue, right? What did it mean for you to have an African perspective, considering all this diversity? How were you thinking about that, and how do you deal with that when you're pursuing your own research?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I've thought a lot about. Also because I have African students in my class. Almost all of them are African students, and so it's important to actually teach global economic history that is relevant to African students. So what I'll say is that there are great texts out there on global economic history. There's also several recent books that I'm sure you will also cover. But almost all of these books are push Africa towards the end of the book. So it's almost like an afterthought, right? So if Africa is engaged with, and I must say, the more recent books do engage more with Africa, but it's often, it starts with the slave trades, focus on colonialism, and maybe a little bit of the independence period. And it then also, what I should add is that it typically just cites, the papers that have been written by top economists at the leading economics department. And I thought, the book on global economic history should start in Africa, because in fact this is where humanity began, and humans exited Africa, and it should end with Africa, right? So the future of the continent, and also within South Africa, which is the focus of my own work. And so if you frame a book like that, and then have not only one chapter focused on Africa, or maybe two, but actually half of the book, or at least a third of the book, focused on South Africa or African topics, then that's a completely different perspective on how we view global economic history. And suddenly, slavery at the Cape is given one chapter, as is the Industrial Revolution or the Protestant Reformation. And so the weights that you assign to different themes, it's not to say that obviously slavery at the Cape has the same impact globally than the Industrial Revolution, but it does give you a different sense of the types of things that happened, and that could influence the kind of the way we think about global economic history. So there are chapters on, for example, pre-colonial African systems, right? Which most studies, or most books, comprehensive kind of books of global economic history, will only focus, as I mentioned, on the slave trade, or begin focusing on Africa when the slave trade happened. Of course, there is a chapter on the slave trade, and of course, there is a chapter on colonialism, but there's also chapters that reflect other parts, like industrialization in South Africa, for example. So it's, these are stories that are not typically part of global economic history stories, but I think it shows different aspects of African history that are important. Or as you mentioned, right, the North African history, conquest of Islam is typically not something that is covered in many of these courses, but have immense importance for global history. It's like it's certainly something that cannot just be pushed to a footnote, which is often the case. So I must say it's not an African history book, right? So it's a book on global economic history, and the focus obviously is on different kind of global episodes, and the focus is on economic history. So there's much obviously diversity and rich scholarship on African history. And again, there you would focus on social history, political history, environmental history, demographic history, a lot of really interesting subfields. My focus is on bringing to the fore aspects that affect our understanding of economic history. And I think part of that is to say many of the things that happened in African economic history is underpinned by economic factors. So when we think of slavery, what is the economic roots of that? Or when we think of colonialism, right? There's great recent papers that show, the terms of trade being very high just before the scramble for Africa started, right? That gives an economic cause for why we observed the scramble when we did. So those are things, I think, that are things that help us understand the world in a better way, in a more comprehensive way than perhaps when we just focus on political, events or revolutions. We might create our own causes when in fact we miss the more fundamental things. So that's really the kind of the reason I think focusing more on Africa helps us understand the world in a better way.
How do you think that, or I guess how much do you think that we need to come up with new concepts or frameworks to think about African history? And I'm motivating this, or I was motivated to ask you about this because I have a chapter in which you make a parallel on feudalism in Europe and feudalism in Africa, right? And I have this complaint regularly in the Latin American context when people talk about feudalism. Many people describe Mexican or Colombian current economic systems as feudal, and I get a cringe. I'm like, there's something that it's feudalism, and there are other things that probably a bunch of parallels that you could build, but these are different type of institutions, if you want, right? I don't know, for the African case, I can imagine that the similarities are stronger, but how much do you think that Africa has singularities that require different type of either concepts or tools to be studied? How concerned are you about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think hope is that we approach the study of these informal, formal institutions in many African countries, but I'll focus on South Africa because that's the one I'm more familiar with. We have a third of South Africans, for example, live still in the former homelands, right? That was created during apartheid, and even though these borders have now been relaxed, there's free movement. We still find high concentrations of South Africa there, and they are by far the poorest areas. And it's partly because there are these sets of institutions that, basically pre-colonial institutions that persisted into the present and that are now legalized and institutionalized by, it was done just after democracy in 1994. And these have there's reason why these areas remain poor. And so that's partly what I hope to show with that chapter is that, sure, you might not call them feudal institutions, but they certainly reflect many of the incentives of feudalism. And studying feudalism is not something that we do just because we care about the Middle Ages in Europe. It's because we want to understand these institutions and the kinds of incentives that these institutions create, and apply them in contexts where they are still relevant, right? So, and it might not even be the homelands, right? You can think of a great institution that I always use in class is our Institute for Accountants, right? That's a guild, right? And we can learn from the theory of guilds as to what the likely outcomes are, right, in the accounting profession in South Africa, if we, just were to analyze it with the same types of tools and approaches. So I think partly it's to motivate why we should study these feudal institutions, and secondly to say that if we understand the potential consequences, we might actually reinvent them or redesign them to have the kind of better outcomes that we hope for, and not be surprised when these former homelands, for example, remain poor, or the salaries of accountants, remain very high, and all of these kind of things that we seemingly might want to change, but ultimately we don't understand the roots of it.
Now that you mentioned pre-colonial institutions, and I think that your book, like the subtitle of your book, is lessons from 100,000 years or so on. You do have a very long-term perspective, and you try to bring that into the book. And that contrasts with most of the way in which Africa has been seen before, that emphasizes the role of colonialism. And so I want to ask you about that. Like, how do you, and although again, like, you don't focus on that in the book, I'm sure that you have these conversations regularly with your students about the role and the legacy of colonialism. It seems to me that the Western world has an increasing interest for that, and have well-deserved sense of guilt for it. But that's a different conversation of how impactful it was for the long-term development of both the colonizers and the colonies. And so I want to hear how you think about that. Of course, I'm not asking you for a very structured, counterfactual, what would have been of Africa if it had not been colonized. But how do you think about those ideas?
I think I'll start with your ending there, and that's to say that it's a useful question in social science, is to say, what do we do when we clearly don't have a counterfactual, right? So that's something that not enough people, I think, are thinking about. Like, how do we answer this question of Africa without colonialism, right? It's almost an impossible counterfactual to imagine, simply because of the kind of the time that it happened, and so what then do we then make of colonialism? And I think it's useful to unpack colonialism into many different types, not only in terms of a taxonomy of the different, informal rule versus or indirect rule, versus direct rule, but also in the types of kind of legacy. So, we are economic historians, and we might think of the economic consequences, but it's really important to also, just say that there are, of course, massive social consequences, demographic consequences, psychological consequences, emotional consequences that I'm certainly not equipped to deal with and think of, what they are and how they might affect not only the generation that experienced the colonialism, but also the generations afterwards. But in terms of the kind of economic consequences, I think it's in the chapter that I write about colonialism, I mention Haldring and Robinson's, which I think is quite a nice chapter as a way to think about this, where they deal explicitly with this idea of a counterfactual and not having one. And they actually divide Africa into kind of three types of colonial experience, where they basically say two of the three they suspect, based on various kinds of evidence, that these changes that the colonial powers brought would probably have happened in any case. And it's only one, a third group really where it's kind of unclear whether this would have happened. And it's partly based on settler economies, and it's partly based on, I think the other split is like, where there was a pre-colonial ruler and got a strong kind of state. So in those two cases, probably those changes would have happened in any case with modernization, with access to international markets and access to international technology. You would have probably seen some of those things. But the third case is unclear. So I just think so one final thought, why do we ask the question? I think is an important first step. And is it to prove some, normative point, which, I'm not sure that, whether this was good or bad, I don't think we can ever answer that question. So I think it's about our values, and there I would be very clear in my view that, given what I've mentioned about the psychological and emotional consequences, my sense is that it's inevitably going to be bad. The question about if it's a positive question in the sense like positive versus normative, that's a more difficult one, because then you clearly want to measure the outcomes compared to the counterfactual. And given that we don't have this counterfactual, I think that's very difficult to establish. So ultimately, why do we ask this question? I'm not sure it's a sensible question to ask in a positive setting, because I just don't think we can get at the answer. And when we ask it in a normative way, I think we have probably ideological or political reasons why we ask this question, and then it's not a very sensible question to answer for exactly those reasons.
How did you bring this issue of normative versus positive perspectives in society? You finished the book trying to think about the future, right? And in that context, you face the challenge of thinking about what the world is going to look like when whatever you say can actually change the world, right? So we're building that future, right? But how do you think about that? How do you perceive the future of South Africa, of Africa, and the world? And again, I think there's a great way of doing the entire conversation of your book being global history. Where do you think we're heading, and what it's gonna, like, if you think that you would be able to still be teaching in 20 years, would your students still be pessimistic, optimistic? How do you think that's going to change in the coming decades?
I recently wrote a column for a South African newspaper where I said that economic historians have the difficult job of being optimistic during bad times and during kind of being more slightly negative, I guess, during good times, when things are going well, when the Bitcoin price is going up massively. We have the job to say, well, this seems very much like a bubble, and temper that enthusiasm. And then when things are really bad, we also have to say, there have been bad times before, and somehow we've managed to managed to go through them and then up again. So I guess that's where we are, right? Because my sense is that the world is in a very difficult place at the moment. There are lots of concerns. War in Europe is continuing. There's global concerns about inflation. There's many issues in the US and Latin American, the political changes, and so I think it is a strange time to be optimistic, but there's also the faith in the ability of human ingenuity. I think is important, and my sense is that if you read history, you know that there were two world wars, and somehow we've managed to, in the following couple of decades, vastly improve human living standards, not only in the rich world, but especially in the developing world. I've recently seen Branko Milanovic's graph. He's got this elephant graph of 1998, I think, to 2008, where he shows it's the poor did pretty well, global poor did pretty well, and the very rich did pretty well. The middle class kind of remained behind. And this latest one, which he recently tweeted, is between 2008 and 2018, and he basically shows that this incredible graph of the poor got incredibly rich, or that's a bad way of phrasing it. The real income of the poor grew at a very high rate, and this high rate declines as you move to the rich, and the richest, their increase is the lowest of all the different across the distribution. So it's a very positive story of how in the last decade, basically before COVID, global inequality was reduced, and that's a to me at least a very positive story to tell about the world. And these are the stories that we typically don't hear, right? Because they happen slowly. We don't observe them very well. They're numbers, and that's not often an easy story to tell. But it is something to be optimistic about. Of course, COVID then happened, and so probably that meant that inequality was exacerbated again. But they are, I think, if we manage to not isolate ourselves, right? If we hopefully don't move to an anti kind of globalization phase, if we continue to be integrated, if we continue to invest in new technologies, it is very likely that the future will be one where our lifespans will continue to increase. Our quality of life will increase, especially those that live in the poorest places in the world, because they benefit most from these technological spillovers. And hopefully that also means that we can live more meaningful lives. The fact that I can speak to you here while sitting in two completely different continents and different time zones, wasn't possible about a decade ago, and here we are. So we don't know what the future. We simply don't know. But if we're slightly creative and we imagine, then we can certainly imagine a better world. So my answer is basically, it's not inevitable that the world will be better, but it can be better, and that's something to hope for.
That's a great answer. You would be a great politician, let me tell you. That could be part of a great political campaign slogan. Let me ask you one final question, which I actually ask all my guests. And that question is, why writing a book and not doing something else, right? Like writing articles. But before letting you answer that question, I want to tell you that comes from an anecdote that I had with you. And probably you don't remember this, but I visited you a few years ago, and you took me on a very nice hike, which, by the way, for people that have not visited, the Stellenbosch area is like the most Asiatic place that you can imagine, right? A beautiful landscape. And we had a very long conversation while we were hiking. And I was describing you a bit how I was trying to find a bit my path as a scholar or whatever, and I was a bit confused, as probably all of us are at some point. And you asked me a question that lighted a lot. It was very insightful how I was thinking about this issue. You asked me, who do you admire? And I gave you a few names, and to me they look very different to each other, right? I told you people that work on networks, some people that are economic historians, some people that are political scientists. And you told me, you know what, there's something that all of them have in common, which is that all of them have written books. And I had never thought about that. And that was a sort of revelation. I feel like, that means something, right? I mean, in a certain way, that sounds like a very shallow feature, like in theory, anyone can write a book, right? But someone that in academia decides to write a book has something in mind, right? And in the cases that we were discussing that day, well, it seemed that all of them were scholars that were trying to engage with a larger audience, that were trying to have a concrete impact in society, and we're not just trying to like feed a list of citations, if you want, right? And that was very important for guiding a bit how I was approaching my professional life. So, and I had that in mind. I think we've never talked about this, but that was very, very important in my life. And I mean, this whole podcast is about books, right? So, tell me about that. Why did you decide to write a book?
I first have to ask you, so when is your book coming out? That's
I hope that's soon, and I'm actually I have a manuscript. So
fantastic. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great news. I mean, there are two answers, right? The first is very practical. I wanted to give my students something to read while they're sitting at home worrying about the world, right? Worrying about the end of the world, because that's certainly what it felt like during those first weeks of COVID. And I have a very kind of, a class full of discussions, and it's just impossible to have these kinds of discussions online. And so I thought, I'll provide them at least with a text. So there's a practical reason for why I did it. And I had the time suddenly in lockdown. You sit at home, and I think not to irritate my wife too much, I tried to keep myself busy. So, but I think the more fundamental reason is that my sense was that students, but also the broader society, increasingly are pessimistic and have lost hope for a better future. And I just thought a longer term perspective helps provide that. And of course, there are great books that already show us that we are doing better. But I think partly what I wanted to do was to answer the question, why is that? So why are we doing better? And that's it helps to have some lessons from history, and then also bring in South Africa and Africa in those stories. And as I said, the audience is actually it was aimed at students, but it's reached new audiences that I would have not imagined, and hopefully now with the new Cambridge edition, it would reach global audiences that would give me feedback and then criticize but it's been wonderful to be part of conversations that I would not have been part of, certainly if I just published papers. And that's partly, that's the thing I've enjoyed actually the most, is to be engaged and trying to actually tell my story to an audience with very different priors, which don't use the same jargon, where you have to simplify concepts, where you have to use language that is understandable, and also where you are exposed to new ideas, right? It's not. I was recently invited to an event where the members of this audience was so different to what I was used to, and they they're all entrepreneurs. They believe wacky things about the world, but they try it, right? They try new things, and sometimes 1 out of 20 works, and they become fabulously rich. All of these guys were fabulously rich. Whereas when we've got an idea and we test it in the kind of market for ideas, you're shot down from every angle. You get 3 referee reports, on the tiniest little detail that you missed. And it was actually really refreshing to be in an audience with crazy ideas and just think, these guys, they made it, and what can I learn from them? Right? What is it about them? What is it about these ideas that I can not maybe even for my academic work, but just in general, like in life? What is it that they have that can help me, build or kind of build a better life and a more meaningful life for myself. So I think that was quite nice. That is quite nice, and that engagement is something that I've enjoyed a lot. So hopefully that will continue going forward.
That's great. That's great. You know, the funny thing is that my work recently and the book is going to be a very pessimistic one. It's going to be on why societies collapse, right? So it's going to be on the other side of at least the moods that we are going to try to.
What I can tell you is that humans have a negativity bias, so your book will certainly sell more than mine.
Well, that'd be great. I'm not gonna lie. I would be very happy with that.
Cool.
No, but I'm very happy to have talked to you. I'm very happy that you decided to write this book. I enjoyed it a lot. I am sure that the international audience is going to enjoy it. It's a great perspective of the world that indeed teaches us also a lot about Africa. And I think there's not much out there that can do that. So I highly recommend the book. And again, I'm very happy to have talked to you. I hope to visit you soon so you can take me on a nice hike again.
Great. Thanks, Javier. It was great to be here, and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.